This episode is brought to you by the Kirtland Partnership Committee. For 30 years, they've been dedicated to supporting, growing, and preserving the Kirtland National Security Complex. They work tirelessly to enhance military readiness, foster community partnerships, improve quality of life, and promote economic development right here in New Mexico. Join their mission to ensure that Kirtland remains a cornerstone of national security and a key provider of quality jobs and investment for all of Greater Albuquerque. Together, we can make a powerful impact. Kirtland Partnership Committee, proudly shaping the future of our national security for 30 years. President Donald Trump's administration is set to implement 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada, which could greatly impact businesses and the import and export business here in New Mexico. With more on what could happen, I'm joined by Albuquerque Journal Business Reporter Matthew Narvaiz. And with the third week of the 2025 legislative session kicking off, advocacy groups here in New Mexico are asking lawmakers to codify data protections for vulnerable groups. With the latest on that story, I'm joined by Albuquerque Journal Assistant Business Editor Megan Gleason. And the United States Supreme Court will hear oral arguments in March involving a Texas case with implications for a temporary nuclear storage facility that could be built here in New Mexico. Albuquerque Journal reporter Oliver Uyttebrouck joins us to discuss the latest on what we can expect from the case. It's Monday, February 3rd, 2025. I'm Gino Gutierrez, and I'll have more on those stories in a few moments, plus a look at the Journal's other headlines and the weather forecast coming up on the leading news. With President Trump set to implement 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, many trading partners within New Mexico and the United States are wondering what comes next. With more on that, I'm now joined by Albuquerque Journal business reporter Matthew Narvaiz, who's been following this story. Matt, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, hi Gina, nice to be here.
And Matt, as we touched on at the top, President Trump and his administration are getting ready to implement these tariffs on Canada and Mexico, and these are key trading partners for the United States, and I'm sure to have some sort of domino effect here in New Mexico. You've been speaking with business leaders and owners here in New Mexico and also local businesses here in Albuquerque. What are they telling you about the impacts of these tariffs?
You know, New Mexico being a border state, having a port of entry in a place like Santa Teresa, we do quite a bit of trade, with businesses on the other side of the border. So a lot of what we see coming from Mexico that people would recognize, right, would be produce. So avocados, limes, tomatoes, jalapenos, in the off season, even, Anaheim peppers, which are otherwise known as green chilies. A lot of that stuff is coming from Mexico, but there's also other things like, auto parts that are being brought from Mexico to, places like Santa Teresa where there are manufacturing operations.
And Matt, you mentioned that produce is one of the key imports the United States gets from Mexico. And here on a local level, you talked to John Gonzalez, who owns the Fruit Basket here in Albuquerque, and he's seen these prices go up firsthand, correct?
Yeah, so, right now the tariffs have not, as of this podcast, will have been put in place. But, Mr. Gonzalez had already told me that, as of last week, a case of large avocados had increased to $85, which was on the very high end of what, his business typically pays for that type of product. They range anywhere, he said, from $40 to $85 a case. They tend to buy 10 or more cases almost every single day. It's a very popular product that they sell. But he, sort of what he insinuated to me is that, his distributors might already be, prepping for what are going to be increased prices likely to come in the coming days and weeks.
And Matt, I would imagine there's a little bit of a trickle-down effect here because now Gonzalez is paying more to get that produce from Mexico, and that price and cost, I would imagine, now is passed on to the consumer as well.
Yeah. I mean, they can't really brunt the cost, right? I mean, they can't pay $85 a case, which has somewhere around 48 avocados, and then charge customers a lot less. Business just doesn't work that way. So, kind of what he had relayed to me is that, there's going to be a chance that there are going to be, increases, again, in the coming days and weeks, and, folks are really going to feel those effects.
But the effects of these tariffs, Matt, is not just down to consumers and business owners, but it's also down to companies that help import and export goods from Mexico into the United States as well. In your story, you talk about how companies in New Mexico, especially in the Santa Teresa area, are postponing expansions and hirings due to the uncertainties around these tariffs. So there's going to be a slowdown for businesses as well.
Yeah, so I had the chance to speak with Jerry Pacheco, the president and CEO of the Border Industrial Association, and this association represents about 80 companies in the area. A lot of them work in the auto parts space, electronics, logistics, and they also have, a presence on the other side of the border. They have a lot of, sister buildings on the other side, basically what Pacheco expressed to me is that, with these tariffs, like as companies, how are we going to bring these products back from Mexico to the U.S. if there's going to be, a tariff imposed on it? So it has been a worry for them. That means extra money out of their pockets, which, if you're going to have to do that, you can't really expand, right? And you can't really hire more folks.
So a lot of different entities, Matt, preparing for the possible impacts of President Trump's tariffs. Albuquerque Journal business reporter Matthew Narvaiz with the latest. Thanks for joining me, Matt.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
With the 60-day legislative session now in full swing, New Mexico right advocacy organizations are calling on state lawmakers to codify data protection measures. With more on what that means, I'm now joined by Albuquerque Journal Assistant Business Editor Megan Gleason. Megan, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Gino.
So Megan, as we enter the third week of the legislative session, we have advocacy groups here in New Mexico that are calling on lawmakers to codify data protection. Can you tell us a little bit about what that means?
Yeah, so basically they're looking to protect New Mexicans, especially vulnerable communities, from having their data unknowingly shared down the line to other states and ultimately federal agencies. There are a few different sects that they're particularly concerned with. For example, we know that ICE has really ramped up deportation raids. And so one example that they want to address is driver's license or license plate information going from the MVD to a private company to another private company and ultimately to ICE.
And Megan, you just touched on something that was pretty integral to your story, and that is the uptick in immigration raids and how data plays a part into that, and how sometimes it's a domino effect where a person's data goes to one company and then another company and another company, and then eventually could end up in the hands of the government.
Yeah, they can, and it's a very common practice for data to be sold off or shared between companies, especially for marketing purposes. And, these advocates do note that it may not be the intention of the state for that information to end up at ICE, but, the state could be contracting with somebody who's contracting with somebody who's contracting with somebody who's with ICE. It's a long line that could lead in those kinds of hands.
But Megan, as you mentioned earlier, these advocacy groups are also worried about different groups that could be affected by data sharing. And one of those has to deal with healthcare, abortion, reproductive health rights. That's something else that these advocacy groups are worried about.
Yeah, this is not a new one either. Like we've seen deportation raids since the Biden administration. We saw the fall of Roe v. Wade some years ago, and that brought up concerns in New Mexico in recent years of reproductive health care and gender affirming rights. And New Mexico has been a haven state, keeping that kind of health care legal and codified. And we've seen people coming in from Texas to get that kind of health care. But the concern here with that is are those neighboring state residents, is their data going to get shared with Texas, who has kind of had a turn in your neighbors approach, or gender affirming care, abortion, stuff that isn't legal in Texas coming over here, and even New Mexicans themselves getting that care, wanting to ensure that their information stays safe and protected.
And another issue of data protection, Megan, on the minds of these advocates is related to the data of transgender and non-binary individuals to prevent targeting and to assure autonomy over their personal information as well.
Yeah, and I mean, under the Trump administration, which has had a lot of non-protective LGBTQ policies, there are rumors of like, for example, transgender people not wanting to go renew their passport or change their gender on federal documents for fear of getting that confiscated. But what they don't have control over, what they can't say no to, is someone taking their data online or seeing if they follow a certain group on Instagram or Facebook and kind of targeting them for that.
And Megan, as we've laid out over the course of this interview, advocates are worried about a lot of different groups here in New Mexico. So what's the legislature doing as far as data protection goes?
Yeah, that remains to be seen. So we're entering the third week of the legislature. We still have a ways to go, and a lot of these bills have yet to be introduced, though it seems likely that we'll be seeing quite a few of these measures this week. But they still have to make it through the entirety of the roundhouse, and that's kind of fighting the stage for other big priorities like crime and healthcare and, It's a long journey for those bills.
So data protection legislation, something we'll definitely keep our eyes on. Megan, I know you and Albuquerque Journal Capitol Bureau Chief Dan Boyd will be keeping an eye on that. For any of our listeners interested in keeping up with more of what's going on in the Roundhouse, they can listen to Dan and Megan on our weekly podcast, Rounding Up the Roundhouse, also here on the Albuquerque Journal Podcast Network. Megan, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
The United States Supreme Court is set to hear oral arguments in March in a Texas case with implications for a private firm's plans to build a temporary storage facility for spent nuclear fuel here in New Mexico. With more on this story, I'm now joined by Albuquerque Journal reporter Oliver Uyttebrouck. Oliver, thank you so much for being here.
Glad to be here, thanks.
So, Oliver, the Supreme Court is set to hear these oral arguments involving the spent nuclear fuel storage facility, but how is New Mexico implicated and why is this case important?
Well, there's actually two different facilities at issue here. This particular case concerns a facility in Texas, but it's only about 40 miles away from another facility in New Mexico. It would be located in Lee County. And Nuclear Regulatory Commission has issued licenses for both of these facilities. So these two facilities are kind of co-joined in everyone's minds, and they will certainly both be at issue in the Supreme Court oral arguments that come up in March 5th.
And Oliver, the plans for this storage facility here in New Mexico has ruffled a lot of feathers, including from state leaders. Attorney General Raul Torres, along with Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham, strongly opposed this plan. Why are they in such strong opposition?
Well, I'm sure there's all sorts of reasons for it, but they basically, Raul Torres issued an amicus brief. He filed an amicus brief in the Supreme Court case, basically arguing that states should have a voice in whether the NRC should be able to license these facilities. And the Court of Appeals, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, agreed with the states in the Texas case. So they sided with the state of Texas, which is also in opposition to their facility, which is just over the Texas border. And basically, the Court of Appeals said that NRC shouldn't be able to issue a license without consulting with the states.
And Oliver, also the proposed sites of these storage facilities also raise concerns. Critics are arguing that they're located in the oil-rich Permian Basin. They also threaten a critical aquifer and the region's economic stability as well.
Well, that's exactly what Attorney General Raul Torres is arguing in his amicus brief, that this is the most productive oil-producing region in the world, or one of them, and it's also got a vulnerable aquifer associated with it. So he's arguing that this is not a good place for a nuclear waste storage facility.
So the Supreme Court's set to hear this case in March, and then probably a few months before we'll know what the ruling is. Albuquerque Journal reporter Oliver Uyttebrouck with the latest. Oliver, thank you so much.
Thank you, Gina.
If you like hearing all of the latest news from the Albuquerque Journal here on the Leading News, consider becoming a digital subscriber to the Albuquerque Journal. You can check our show notes for a discount code on a digital subscription and keep up with all the latest news from New Mexico's leading news source. In other headlines from the newsroom, an Albuquerque community safety responder helped prevent a fellow first responder from taking their own life, highlighting the vital role of behavioral health support. Dana Gonzalez spent hours on the phone de-escalating the crisis, emphasizing that mental health struggles can affect anyone. In 2024, ACS handled an average of 195 suicide-related calls per month, underscoring the ongoing need for compassionate intervention. The department, which launched in 2021, continues to provide critical non-police responses to behavioral health crises. And a courtroom brawl erupted Monday during a hearing for accused murderer Alexander Ortiz, as the victim's family attacked him, leading to chaos that injured a corrections officer. Carlos Lucero and Pete Yazzie, who initiated the attack, were arrested but later released. Video shows Lucero jumping the gate and striking Ortiz with others, including Ortiz's father, joining the melee. Ortiz remains jailed, facing charges in 2 murders. His rescheduled hearing on February 7th will have additional security. And in sports news, the Lobos struggled early but dominated the final 15 minutes to secure an 82-63 win over Utah State. Despite a hostile crowd and a slow start, UNM closed the game on a 43-15 run, securing sole possession of first place in the Mountain West. Looking for something to do today? Craft Your Heart Out free Valentine's card making is happening from 4 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. at Meow Wolf Santa Fe's House of Eternal Return. And a free tango class is happening from 6 p.m. to 6:45 p.m. at Porta del Tango. Gardening with native plants, enjoying nature at home is happening from 6 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. at Cherry Hills Public Library. And karaoke is happening from 8 p.m. to midnight at Bourbon and Boots. Now taking a look at Albuquerque's weather forecast. Today you can expect partly sunny skies with a high near 69, and this evening mostly cloudy with a low around 36. To keep up with all the latest news from the Albuquerque Journal, you can visit our website at abqjournal.com. For the leading news, I'm Gino Gutierrez.